So as of now, I'm sure that pretty much everybody who will click on and watch this video has heard about what has happened between Ukraine and the United States over the past several weeks, and especially over the past couple of days, where the United States, and especially President Donald Trump, has gotten increasingly aggressive in their demands of Ukraine to try to force them into a peace deal with Russia that Ukraine currently does not find to be in their best interests without security guarantees. I'll spare you all of the details that have led up to here, except for the fact that over the past couple of days, to really try to force Ukraine's hand here, the United States has decided to pause military aid to Ukraine. This pause of military aid includes not just things like weapons and ammunition, but also more intangible types of support, like the sharing of military intelligence, and also U.S. offensive cyber attacks that were taking place against Russia. What seems to be happening right now is that the United States is trying to force Ukraine to end the war by withholding their support for them. In this video, I want to talk about what will probably happen next. Where does Ukraine go from here? Can Ukraine still continue to fight, or is Ukraine going to be forced into a peace that they find unacceptable? Throughout this video, I will try to be succinct, but I will also try to cover sufficiently several different topics related to this overall topic. I will cover, of course, U.S. aid to Ukraine and how valuable that was, and whether or not it's likely to continue and what impact that will make on the battlefield. I'll talk a little bit about European aid and whether that aid can make up for the gaps of lost U.S. aid, and I will also talk about whether the changes on the battlefield will actually be sufficient to get Ukraine to change their mind about wanting to continue fighting for their freedom against Russia, or whether Ukraine will be forced to basically surrender and capitulate because of this. Finally, I will talk about whether or not things could actually get worse. Namely, I will address a lot of the rumors that maybe Trump is on Russia's side. I will give my thoughts on that and my thoughts on whether or not Trump could make things worse for Ukraine beyond just removing U.S. aid from them. A lot to discuss, so let's dive in. So first, let's talk about U.S. aid itself and how significant the loss actually is. Since the war in Ukraine began, both the media and U.S. administrations have, I think, vastly overplayed the importance of the aid that the United States has allocated to Ukraine. And I use the word allocated very specifically and on purpose, because most of the aid that the United States has given to Ukraine has not actually been given to them, it has merely been allocated. Congress has created decently large spending packages, not nearly as large as what a lot of people have portrayed, and the vast majority of those spending packages have not actually been spent, meaning that up to this point, the United States has not actually given all that much aid to Ukraine, and it has actually given far less to Ukraine than Europe. That is not to say that the United States' contributions are not important and that the United States has done nothing. The contributions of the United States have been very important, particularly when it comes to protecting the lives of Ukrainian people, in particular, innocent Ukrainian people, civilians, largely, primarily because of our air defense systems, which have been critical, but not the only component when it comes to defending Ukrainian cities. Our Patriot missiles are the best of the best, and our Patriot air defense systems are able to intercept certain classes of Russian attacks that European systems cannot always do, particularly Russian ballistic missile attacks. So U.S. aid has been significant, and it has certainly helped Ukraine's war effort. However, U.S. aid is not the factor in Ukraine's war against Russia. It is simply a factor. And as a factor, and not the factor, it means that whether or not the United States supported Ukraine, and therefore whether or not the United States continues to support Ukraine, Ukraine still would have had a war effort to defend their country, and probably still will have a war effort to defend their country. And losing that aid doesn't mean that Ukraine is going to capitulate. Losing that aid simply means that Ukraine is now going to have a harder fight, and more Ukrainians are going to die than is necessary. Now, losing more Ukrainians than necessary, more innocent people than necessary, can and should rightfully make most of us angry. But it is not the same thing as Ukraine losing. So with that in mind, we need to look at what the battlefield will look like now for Ukraine, assuming U.S. aid is paused for a long time or never, in fact, returns. Now, U.S. aid could, in fact, return, and it could return very soon. But at this point, we also know that it could be taken away at the flip of a hat. And so this video is going to seek to examine as if the aid will never return, because that is a situation the world needs to prepare for. That's the situation Europe needs to prepare for, and that's the situation that Ukraine needs to be prepared for. And hopefully we can be pleasantly surprised by something different. When U.S. aid leaves Ukraine and Ukraine runs out of stockpiles of U.S. weapons, it is going to create some gaps on the battlefield, but not as many as most people think. The first major gap will be those Patriot air defense systems that I mentioned, but Ukraine is not going to be left without air defense. There's just going to be a couple of holes in their air defense that they shouldn't have had to have, but now they will. That means that more Russian missiles will be able to get through, and potentially Russia will be able to continue firing on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and being a lot more successful in doing that. However, while Europe won't be able to defend the actual energy infrastructure with the air defense systems that they have available to them, as well as if they had Patriots, Europe can provide Ukraine with generators. And so what Europe is not able to defend of Ukraine's, Europe can still replace. And so in that category, Ukraine is not in as bad of a position as it could be. Worse than it has to be, not as bad as it could be. Now, even more than that, the situation that I've just laid out assumes that Ukraine no longer has access to U.S. weapons systems, which might not actually be the case. At this point, Ukraine might not just be getting those weapon systems given to them by the United States, but as of now, it is still possible for European nations to purchase those weapon systems and deliver them to Ukraine. And so we see a cut of direct ties between Ukraine and the United States, but Ukraine still potentially having the ability to indirectly get the things it needs. And it turns out that that also applies to U.S. intelligence, at least as of now. While the United States has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine, the United States is still sharing intelligence about Ukraine with European intelligence agencies. And probably those agencies are going to be willing to share critical information with Ukraine still. So again, we see almost a political move by the United States to make it seem like they're totally cutting Ukraine off, when in reality, Ukraine still has back channels to the most important things the United States has been providing. They just have to do it with the Europeans' dollars instead of the Americans' dollars. That will diminish European budgets overall that they could be spending on other things, but it's not the end of the world. It's just an obstacle. That being said, because the United States has made this move, because the United States has now shown its hand that it is willing to cut off support to Ukraine basically at the flip of a hat, that has invigorated Europe, which is now standing up with very strong action and some very large spending bills intended to support Ukraine in a meaningful way. Now, with that said, it also bears noting that Ukraine's situation now, at this moment, is actually significantly improved over Ukraine's situation at the beginning when Russia first conducted their full-scale invasion. I know it doesn't seem that way. I know a lot of people try to make it not seem that way. But the reality is that when Russia first did their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine was not fighting back against Russia with a significant amount of Western-supplied weapons. Those actually took some time to arrive because if you remember, everybody thought Ukraine would be defeated in just a couple of days or just a couple of weeks. But Ukraine largely defeated and halted Russia's advances on their own, and it wasn't really until after Ukraine had halted Russia on their own with older stockpiles of gear that Western equipment really started arriving in force. Now at this moment, Ukraine does have their hands on Western equipment, and they are holding the line against Russia very strongly. They have not lost much territory to Russia at all over the past couple of years, basically since Russia's initial invasion, with a few minor exceptions. And a long time throughout pretty much the entire war, Ukraine has been fighting against Russia, even with Western support, with Russia having a massive artillery advantage over Ukraine, an artillery advantage of around 10-1. Now that artillery advantage has been reduced to 2-1, and that is not going to go away even if the United States backs out. Most of Ukraine's ability to close this artillery gap has come because of new domestic production on Ukrainian territory itself, and most of the rest of it has come from European partners providing Ukraine with artillery, which they still very much have the ability to do. Now, even more than that, not just artillery, but also in drones, Ukraine has made major advances since Russia first initially invaded, and Ukraine was able to hold them back then, even when they were at a much higher level of strength. Now Ukraine has made huge advances in drones. They have their own drone manufacturing capabilities. And in fact, this is one category where Ukraine actually has so many drones that they have considered exporting them to other nations. So they don't need US support to keep up with artillery or with drones. Critically, these are the two most important pieces when it comes to Ukraine holding the line against Russia, taking more Ukrainian territory. Artillery and drones. So Ukraine is not going to lose its ability to defend itself against Russia, even if the United States were to fully back out. Now, the only way that this situation would change and get worse for Ukraine is if the United States took a step that they are exceedingly unlikely to do, which is to not just stop supporting Ukraine, but to start actively supporting Russia. Literally taking the support they were giving to Ukraine and giving it to Russia instead. Now, I know there are a lot of concerns that something like this could happen, but I want to tell you that these concerns I do not think are based in reality. Even if the rumors are true, and Donald Trump is a Russian agent of some kind, or he is compromised by Russia in doing what they want for one reason or another, even then, the United States is not likely to actively support Russia for a lot of different reasons. In the United States right now, it is true that about 44% of Americans think that the United States has been giving too much support to Ukraine, which is less than half. And by the way, people believing that we are giving too much support to Ukraine doesn't mean those people believe the answer is to give Ukraine nothing at all. But in either case, more than half of the country still wants to continue supporting Ukraine at the current level or even more. And so already Donald Trump's moves here are very unpopular with the majority. On the flip side, only 4% of Americans actually support Russia's invasion. I don't even know how the number is that high. That's discouraging. But 4% is not nearly enough for a president like Donald Trump, even if he wanted to support Russia. I can promise you the American people would not tolerate that. There would be significant action and Donald Trump would probably be impeached. And he knows that. Especially when you consider that Trump's argument against the war in Ukraine has primarily been about how much money we're spending. That has been the thing that him and a lot of Republicans have been complaining about. It is very unlikely that they're going to take money that we've been giving to Ukraine and then actively support Russia. Now, one action that Donald Trump can do is that he can remove sanctions on Russia. This does not scare me as much as it scares a lot of people. I don't think it would be very meaningful if the United States removed sanctions against Russia, because I think the response to that would be for, just like in the case of removing military aid, for Europe to stand up a lot stronger. Most of Russian oil, almost all Russian oil, goes through the Black Sea and the Baltic. And both of those mean that Russian oil tankers have to pass through European choke points, European controlled choke points, in order to get out to the global markets. If Donald Trump removes sanctions on Russia, if the European Union really wanted to, they could easily start seizing Russian vessels and basically physically forcing Russian oil to not be able to reach the markets. And if the European Union didn't have the will to do that, Ukraine itself could stop Russian oil from reaching world markets by targeting Russian facilities, Russian port facilities, where energy is actually physically loaded onto ships. Ukraine has already hit facilities in and around these areas. They've demonstrated that they have the capability to do it, but they haven't made that choice yet. But I bet you that if Donald Trump removes sanctions on Russia, they could probably take that step. So with all of this in mind, as bad as the situation is for Ukraine right now, it's not easy for the situation to be made worse. And that is good news. We can see ourselves at basically a base level now, and we can build up from there. Now, with all of this in mind, and there's a lot more I could say, but I'm trying to be succinct here, one could argue that the current situation is producing a better outcome for Ukraine than otherwise would have happened. Obviously, the best outcome would be for the United States to get behind Ukraine strongly. But it's now clear that that was never going to happen under this current administration. So basically not for at least 4 more years. So with that in mind, the second best outcome for Ukraine is what is happening now. For Ukraine and the entire rest of the world to have clarity that they cannot count on the United States so that they can actually begin decisively taking the actions that they should have been taking years ago to produce a victory for Ukraine in a different way. Where will the war go from here? Well, it's not likely to end. Ukraine is not likely to capitulate to Russia. They are willing to have a ceasefire. If security guarantees are granted, that is a possibility, and that's not the worst possibility in the world, although it is disappointing. But Ukraine is not likely to capitulate to Russia. What will probably happen in this war is that the battle lines will remain frozen for a longer time. More people will suffer and more people will die because of inadequate efforts to produce peace that never listened to Ukraine and the arguments they were making. It will take time for Europe to get their spending bills approved, and even more time for those spending bills to produce weapons for Ukraine. But eventually, those spending bills will come through. That support will come through. Ukraine will be able to hold the line up until then, and we will probably be able to see a breakthrough win for Ukraine if the support continues. It is just now going to take extra years than it would take if the United States had gotten meaningfully involved. Now, the path to the quickest peace here then we see is not to remove support for Ukraine, but actually to accelerate it. Unfortunately, that's not the path the United States has chosen. Now, with that in mind, more positive outcomes are still possible. It is still possible that Ukraine will sign a deal with the United States and that that deal will ultimately result in U.S. aid being continued to Ukraine. And in that case, U.S. aid will have continued and Europe will have been invigorated and it will be a better outcome overall. There is still a strong chance that Donald Trump's behavior is because he is trying to negotiate a stronger deal with Ukraine that is more favorable to the United States. This behavior to get here is abhorrent. It is morally repulsive, but it is not at all unlike Trump, who approaches the entire world as if it's one big real estate deal, where he has to flex and show his toughness and his walk-away power, even when real people's lives are at stake. Even more than that, people in the United States, like myself, as I said, the majority does not support the behavior of the current administration pausing aid to Ukraine. And it's possible that that could produce an outcome as well, because the US government is a whole lot bigger than just the president. So we'll continue to work for the best outcomes possible. I'll continue to share information and facts on this channel as I have them. But for now, be encouraged. It's a bad day. It's a bad week. But it's not as bad as it could be, and it's very far from over. Now, before you go, if I can ask for a quick favor, if you appreciated this video and these insights, you can support my work on this channel on Patreon. I've got a lot of hard work ahead of me and doing everything I can to support Ukraine in the United States. It may not be much, but we're going to do what we can. And so if you want to be part of that, there's myself and there's other channels, but you can scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.